She was the woman no one looked at twice. The one who refilled her own coffee, ate lunch alone at her desk, and answered to a boss who couldn't balance a checkbook without her help. For 7 years, Naomi Mercer did the invisible work that kept a billion-dollar firm from collapsing, and received exactly nothing in return. Then one morning, a stranger walked into a conference room full of powerful men, looked past every one of them, and asked her what she saw. What happened next would tear apart one of New York's most powerful corporations from the inside out. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The conference room on the 41st floor of Hargrove and Sloan Financial Group smelled like ambition and expensive cologne, a combination Naomi Mercer had long since learned to breathe through without flinching. She sat at the far end of the table, the chair closest to the wall, the one nobody else wanted because the heating vent directly above it rattled every time the system cycled on. She had placed her legal pad squarely in front of her, uncapped her pen, and was already 3 pages deep in margin notes before the first senior partner had finished adjusting his tie. She did not belong here. That was the unspoken agreement everyone in the room had silently ratified. She was 30 years old, junior by title, if not by actual competence, and she had been assigned to this audit review the same way office plants were assigned to windowsills, to fill a space no one else wanted because the lighting was bad and the air was stale and nobody really expected much to grow there. Her supervisor, Director of Financial Oversight, Gregory Holt, sat 4 chairs to her left. He was 52, broad through the shoulders, with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades learning how to make other people's work sound like his own. He did not look at her when he settled into his seat. He hadn't looked at her in 7 years. She had stopped expecting it somewhere around year 3. The Vail Global Logistics delegation arrived at 9:13, which was 4 minutes past the scheduled start time, and yet felt, in the way it always does when important people are late, like an arrival precisely on time. There were 5 of them. 3 senior executives with matching expressions of careful neutrality, a legal counsel who surveyed the room the way attorneys survey rooms, cataloging exits and vulnerabilities simultaneously, and the man at the front, Adrian Vail. Naomi had read his file. 33 years old, heir to the Vail global empire, his father had built from a single freight brokerage in Newark into an international logistics operation moving over $40 billion in cargo annually across 6 continents. The financial press called him aggressive, visionary, and occasionally reckless. The internal memos she had been given access to suggested something more complicated. A man who had spent 15 years in his father's shadow and was now, following his father's sudden retirement 18 months ago due to declining health, stepping into daylight for the first time and still blinking against the brightness. He wore a charcoal suit, no pocket square. His watch was expensive but understated in a way that suggested either genuine indifference to display or a very sophisticated understanding of how indifference to display functions as its own kind of display. He carried nothing, no folder, no device, no notepad. He sat down, looked around the table once with the even, measuring patience of someone taking inventory, and then settled his attention on Gregory Holt. "Mr. Holt," he said. His voice was quieter than she had expected. "I want to understand your firm's findings on the Meridian subsidiary accounts before we go further." Gregory smiled the smile Naomi had watched him deploy 10,000 times across 10,000 meetings. Open, assured, the practiced warmth of a man who had learned early that confidence, projected cleanly enough, could substitute for almost anything else. "Absolutely. Our team has conducted a comprehensive review of all Meridian-connected accounts across the last 36 months. I'm pleased to report the numbers are exactly where they should be. Full transparency, clean reconciliations across the board." It was not a lie, precisely. It was the thing Gregory Holt had always been expert at. A statement architecturally sound enough to withstand a first-pass inspection while containing, embedded in its structure, the load-bearing omission that would only become visible to someone who already knew where to press. Naomi's pen moved. She had been sitting with the Meridian subsidiary files for 11 days. Not because she had been asked to. She had not been asked to, but because the initial data package had passed across her desk in the process of routine filing, and something in the maintenance contract line items had snagged in her mind the way a loose thread snags on a rough surface, not dramatically, not catastrophically, just persistently, with the low-grade insistence of a thing that does not want to be ignored. The discrepancy was not large. That was the point. Whoever had constructed it understood that large discrepancies create alarm, and alarm creates scrutiny. And scrutiny is the enemy of a scheme that needs time and invisibility to operate. What she had found instead was a pattern of small maintenance contract disbursements, each one plausible in isolation, each one generating no individual red flag, that when mapped across 36 months against the operational cycle of 4 specific Meridian subsidiary locations, resolved into a clear and consistent rhythm of payments, flowing to vendors that did not, in any documented sense, exist. Shell companies. 3 of them, registered in Delaware, Wyoming, and the Isle of Man respectively, all sharing the same registered agent. A detail buried deeply enough that finding it had required her to cross-reference incorporation databases across 3 jurisdictions during the 11 evenings she had spent alone at her desk after Gregory had gone home. The total across 36 months was slightly over $14 million. She had not told Gregory. She had considered it once on the 3rd night, when the full shape of it had become clear to her. She had sat in the empty office with the lights of the city blinking 41 floors below and thought very carefully about what it would mean to tell him and what it would mean not to, and she had decided that she needed more information before she did anything at all. Because Gregory Holt did not keep secrets from clients. Gregory Holt managed clients, which was a different thing entirely, and managing sometimes required knowing exactly how much of a problem to reveal and how much to contain, and she was not yet certain which category $14 million of probable fraud fell into when the client was Adrian Vale, and the perpetrators were people whose names she hadn't yet been able to identify. Mr. Holt, Adrian Vale's voice was still quiet. The Meridian maintenance accounts. Walk me through the vendor verification process. Gregory did not miss a beat. He never did. Standard 3-tier vendor review. All contractors screened for licensing compliance, insurance certification, and service history before any contract is awarded, full documentation on file. Which contractors specifically handled the HVAC and structural maintenance for the Newark and Baltimore facilities between 18 and 30 months ago? A pause. Half a second, maybe less. Naomi watched Gregory's jaw reset. I'd need to pull the specific contractor records to give you exact names. We can have that compiled by end of day. Adrian looked at him for a moment. Then his eyes moved. They moved without any particular urgency, and they did not travel around the table the way eyes usually travel in a conference room, skipping the irrelevant, settling on the relevant, performing the social mathematics of who matters and who doesn't. Instead, they moved slowly, with the deliberate evenness of someone conducting a genuine search rather than a social calculation. And they found Naomi at the end of the table under the rattling vent, and they stopped. She did not look away. She had learned long ago that looking away was what people expected, and that expectations, when fulfilled, made you disappear even further. You've been writing since we sat down, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said. What's on the pad? Gregory's head turned toward her. Across the table, she could feel the particular quality of that attention. Sharp, warning, the silently transmitted instruction of a man who has just realized a variable he thought he controlled has developed an uncontrolled behavior. She looked at Adrian Vale. Discrepancies, she said. The room went still in the way rooms go still when something true has been said in a place where truth was not scheduled to appear. Adrian leaned forward slightly. Tell me. Gregory moved first. Naomi handles junior support work on this account. She wouldn't have access to the full audit framework, so anything she's... Mr. Holt. Adrian did not raise his voice. He simply redirected it, cleanly, the way you redirect a stream with a placed stone. I asked her. Naomi set her pen down. She was aware of her heartbeat, not racing, just present, insisting on itself in the way it sometimes did in the moments before she said a thing that couldn't be unsaid. The Meridian subsidiary maintenance contracts across the Newark, Baltimore, Trenton, and Hoboken facilities show a consistent payment pattern to 3 vendor entities that have no verifiable operational history, she said. Apex Structural Solutions, LLC, Meridian Building Services Group, and Coastline Facility Management. All 3 were incorporated within a 6-week window approximately 38 months ago. All three share a registered agent at 1150 North Market Street in Wilmington. None of the three appear in any contractor licensing database for the states in which they allegedly performed work. Aggregate disbursements across 36 months total $14.3 million. The silence that followed was the kind Naomi knew well. Not the silence of people processing information, but the silence of people recalibrating their understanding of what kind of problem they were suddenly inside. Adrian Vale's expression did not change visibly. But something behind his eyes shifted. A slight hardening, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man who has just had something confirmed that he suspected but had not yet been able to prove. "How long have you known this?" he asked her. 11 days. "And your supervisor?" She looked at Gregory Holt for the first time since the meeting began. He was looking back at her with an expression that was doing its best to remain composed and not quite succeeding. "I haven't briefed him yet," she said. There was nothing technically wrong with that statement. It was the truth. It was also the most devastating thing she could have said in that room at that moment. And she had known that when she said it, and she had said it anyway, because 7 years of invisible labor had calcified inside her into something harder than caution. Gregory Holt said quietly, "Naomi, that's a significant mischaracterization of a—" "Mr. Holt," Adrian said, still quiet, still even. "I'd like the room, please." Gregory looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "I'd like everyone except Ms. Mercer to step out. 5 minutes." It was not a request, and everyone in the room understood that it was not a request. Gregory gathered himself with the practiced dignity of a man who has absorbed many professional humiliations and learned to perform them as something other than what they are. And he rose. And the other Hargrove and Sloan people rose with him. And the Vale Global executives followed, and the attorney, and in 90 seconds the conference room on the 41st floor contained only 2 people and the rattling of the overhead vent. Adrian Vale looked at her across the length of the empty table. "Why didn't you tell him?" It was a reasonable question. It was also a question that required her to say something she had not planned to say to anyone. "Because I wasn't sure what he'd do with it," she said. "What does that mean?" She thought about editing it. She decided not to. "It means that in 7 years I've watched Gregory Holt present my work to clients as his own approximately 400 times. It means I've watched him identify which problems to solve for clients and which problems to manage around, depending on what's most convenient for the firm's relationship with the client. And it means that $14 million of potential fraud in a major client's subsidiary accounts is exactly the kind of problem that gets managed around if the person holding it is trying to protect a billing relationship." Adrian Vale sat with that for a moment. His hands were flat on the table. Outside, 41 floors down, the city went about its enormous, indifferent business. "You're saying he would have buried it." "I'm saying I wasn't sure he wouldn't, and I wasn't willing to hand it to him until I was sure." He looked at her with an attention that was different from any attention she had received in this building in 7 years. Not the attention of someone evaluating her presentation or her confidence, or the question of whether someone who looked the way she looked belonged in a room like this one. It was the attention of someone reading a document, precise, unsentimental, interested only in what was actually there. "You have documentation," he said. It wasn't a question. Everything I described. Corporate registration filings, payment records cross-referenced against contractor licensing databases, registered agent verification. It's in my bag. "You brought it." "I've been carrying it for 5 days, in case." Something moved across his face that might, in another context, have been called the beginning of a smile, but landed instead as a kind of recognition, the expression of a man who has spent his life in rooms full of people performing competence, encountering, for the first time in a long time, something that didn't need to perform. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "how long is your notice period at Hargrove and Sloan?" She looked at him. 2 weeks? "Give it this afternoon," he said. "I'll have an offer on your desk by the time you're back from lunch. Chief Financial Strategist, Vale Global Logistics. You'll have full access to every account, every subsidiary, every financial record the company holds across all 6 operating regions. No filters, no intermediaries. Report directly to me." The heating vent rattled overhead. Somewhere in the building, an elevator chimed. Naomi did not allow herself the small luxury of showing what was happening in her chest. She had spent 30 years learning to keep that particular information private, and this did not seem like the moment to stop. "You don't know anything about me?" she said. I know you found what $14 million worth of professional auditors didn't find in 36 months, he said. I know you sat on it for 11 days and did additional verification rather than handing it to your boss to manage, which tells me you have better instincts than most people I pay considerably more than I'm about to pay you. And I know you just said the truest thing that's been said in this building in what I'm guessing is a very long time. He paused. What else do I need to know? She thought about it. She thought about 7 years of early mornings and late nights, and the specific quality of silence that builds up around a person who is never acknowledged, the way dust accumulates in corners no one bothers to clean. She thought about the 400 times her work had come back to her wearing someone else's name. I'm not easy to work with, she said. I don't let things go. I'm not diplomatic about numbers. If I find something wrong, I'll tell you it's wrong, regardless of who's in the room or what the consequences are. Good, he said simply. And I won't be managed. He met her eyes. I'm not looking for someone to manage. I'm looking for someone who can see. She picked up her pen. She capped it. She placed it in her bag beside the folder that contained 11 days of careful, invisible work. I'll give my notice at 2 o'clock, she said. Gregory Holt was waiting in the hallway when she came out. She could read the expression on his face precisely. The calculation running behind his controlled exterior, the rapid assessment of damage, of narrative, of how the story of what had just happened in that conference room could be shaped into something less catastrophic for him than what it actually was. Naomi, he kept his voice low. Whatever you said in there, I need you to understand that going around the chain of command on a client engagement is a serious, I found $14 million in fraudulent vendor payments, Gregory, she said. She did not lower her voice. 11 days ago, I documented it thoroughly. I came to work today prepared to present it in this meeting to this client, which is what I just did. That's not the established protocol for, I'll have my resignation on your desk by 2, she said, and walked past him toward the elevator. She kept her face still. She kept her breathing even. She pressed the elevator call button and waited. And when the doors opened, she stepped inside. And when the doors closed, she stood in the mirrored box of the elevator car and looked at herself for the 3 seconds it took to descend 1 floor before she pressed the button for the lobby and let the building carry her down. Her phone buzzed before she reached the ground floor. An email from an address she didn't recognize with a Vail Global Logistics domain. Subject line, employment offer, chief financial strategist. The attachment was already there. She stared at the screen. Then she put her phone in her pocket. She had 11 days of careful work in her bag and a job offer on her phone, and the specific, unfamiliar sensation of being seen by someone for the first time in a very long time. It did not feel the way she had always imagined it would feel. It felt more complicated than that. It felt like standing at the edge of a very large thing and not yet knowing whether what was on the other side of it was solid ground. She walked out through the lobby of Hargrove and Sloan and into the morning air of Lower Manhattan and stood on the sidewalk while the city moved around her. She did not yet know that the $14 million she had found was not the full extent of what was buried in Vail Global's accounts. She did not yet know that the people who had put it there were still inside the company, watching, and that one of them had already noticed her name in the audit documentation. She did not know that by accepting Adrian Vail's offer, she had made herself visible to people who had spent years relying on financial crimes to remain invisible themselves, and that visible, in their world, was a condition that carried its own particular kind of danger. She stood on the sidewalk in the October morning, her bag on her shoulder and 7 years of being overlooked behind her, and she thought, fine. She thought, let them look. She did not yet understand what looking would cost. The offer letter was 4 pages long and written in the precise, bloodless language of corporate legal departments everywhere. But the number on page 2 made Naomi sit down on the edge of her bed at 11:17 on a Tuesday night and read the paragraph 3 times before she believed it. She had spent the afternoon in the kind of controlled motion that follows a decision too large to fully absorb, clearing her desk at Hargrove and Sloan with the focused efficiency of someone diffusing something, handing Gregory Holt a printed resignation letter at 2:03 p.m. Watching his face do the thing faces do when the person you have taken for granted for 7 years demonstrates, with a single piece of paper, that they were always capable of leaving. He had said things, professional things, measured things designed to locate the situation inside a narrative where he retained some control over its meaning. She had listened with the same courteous attention she had given everything he'd said for 7 years, and had felt, for the first time, the specific freedom of a person who no longer needs anything from the room they're standing in. She signed the Vail Global offer letter at 11:45 p.m. and sent it back without negotiating a single term. The number was fair, more than fair. But more than the number, the language in Clause 7 had stopped her. Full unmediated access to all financial records, accounts, subsidiaries, and operational data across all Vail Global entities, with direct reporting to the Chief Executive Officer and no requirement for departmental pre-approval on audit activity. She had read that clause 4 times. In 7 years at Hargrove and Sloan, she had never been given access to anything without Gregory Holt's prior authorization. The idea of operating without a filter between herself and the actual data felt less like a professional upgrade and more like a physiological change, like being handed the use of a sense she'd been managing without. She started on Monday. The Vail Global headquarters occupied floors 22 through 38 of a glass tower on Park Avenue that smelled, on the inside, exactly like money managed at sufficient scale to become invisible. Not the aggressive cologne and leather smell of places still trying to demonstrate wealth, but the neutral, climate-controlled, faintly recycled air of an institution so far past demonstration that it had forgotten the impulse entirely. The executive floor was 36. Her office was on 35, which she understood immediately was a message, not a hostile one, but a precise one, close enough to matter. Not quite inside the innermost circle, not yet. Her assistant was a 26-year-old named Daniel Cho, who had clearly been briefed to expect someone more conventionally impressive and was doing the professional work of adjusting his expectations in real time as she set her bag down on the desk and asked him to pull every Meridian subsidiary account file going back 48 months. All of them? He said, starting with Newark and Baltimore, then Trenton and Hoboken, then every other facility with maintenance contract activity over $500,000 in any rolling 12-month period. He looked at the wall of filing cabinets along the east side of her office. That's going to be a significant... I know, she said. Start with the digital records. Flag anything where the vendor appears in fewer than 2 facilities. He started. She spent her first week doing what she always did when she arrived somewhere new. She read. Not selectively. Everything. Contract files, payment histories, vendor verification records, subsidiary operating reports, internal audit memos from the previous 3 years. She read with the focused, methodical attention of someone who has learned that the thing you're looking for is almost never where it appears to be, and that finding it requires first understanding the entire landscape well enough to recognize what doesn't belong. What she found in the first week was worse than she had expected, and she had expected something fairly bad. The Meridian fraud was not isolated. It was the most visible piece of a larger architecture, a network of fictitious vendor relationships, duplicate payment schemes, and inflated contract values distributed across 11 subsidiary operations in 4 states, totaling, by her initial calculation, somewhere between $38 and $42 million across 4 years. The money moved in small enough increments that it had escaped detection in every internal audit. It had also, she noted, escaped detection in 3 separate external audits, 2 conducted by firms she recognized, 1 conducted by Hargrove and Sloan. She sat with that information for a day before she brought it to Adrian. His office was on 36, corner position, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides with a view north and east that on a clear morning let you see all the way to the Bronx. He was at his desk when she knocked on the open door, working through a stack of documents with the slightly disheveled focus of someone who is genuinely engaged with the material rather than performing engagement for an audience. He looked up. "Close the door," he said. She closed it and sat down across from him and placed the summary document she had prepared on the desk between them. 12 pages. No executive summary. She had decided that the kind of person who needed an executive summary for a document this important was not the kind of person who needed to receive this information, and Adrian Vail had not struck her as a person who needed his material pre-digested. He read it straight through without interrupting her. 17 minutes, she counted. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the surface of his desk for a moment. $40 million, he said. Conservative estimate. The full number could be higher once I complete the regional subsidiary review. 4 years. The earliest transactions I've identified date to 51 months ago. There may be earlier activity I haven't reached yet. He was quiet for another moment. She watched the quality of that quiet. Not shock exactly. More the specific stillness of a man who is rearranging a large number of things simultaneously and needs the silence to do it cleanly. Who else have you told? No one. Daniel? He pulled the files. He doesn't know what I found in them. Adrian leaned back in his chair. The city spread out behind him, indifferent and enormous. This went through 3 external audits. Yes. Including your former firm. Yes. He looked at her directly. Are you telling me Hargrove and Sloan missed this, or are you telling me something else? She had thought carefully about how to answer this question, because it was the question that mattered most, and the one she had the least clean answer to. I'm telling you that the pattern is consistent with deliberate concealment, sophisticated enough to survive a standard external audit process. I'm not yet in a position to tell you whether the auditors who reviewed these accounts were deceived by the concealment or were aware of it. He received that with the same flat attention he'd given everything else. You're saying the auditors might be dirty. I'm saying I don't know yet, and I don't think you should assume they're clean. He nodded once. What do you need? Full access to the internal audit team's working papers from the last 4 years, and I need to know who commissioned the external audits and who selected the firms. Malcolm Pierce selected the external auditors, Adrian said. He's head of executive advisory. He's been with the company 22 years. She wrote the name down. I'll need his commission records. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Not resistance, exactly, but the particular friction of a man being asked to suspect someone he has trusted for a very long time. Malcolm has been with my family since before I came into the business. I understand, she said. I'm not accusing him of anything. I need the records because the data requires them. He was quiet again. Then, you'll have them. The executive board meeting happened on her 3rd Thursday. She had known it was scheduled. She had not known she would be required to attend until Adrian's assistant called her office at 8 a.m. to inform her that Mr. Vale had added her to the agenda. There were 11 board members present, plus Adrian at the head of the table, and Malcolm Pierce at his right, a compact white-haired man of 61 with careful gray eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who has operated at the center of power long enough that urgency no longer impresses him. He looked at Naomi when she entered the boardroom with the polite, measured assessment of a man cataloging a new variable, and she looked back at him with the same courtesy and noted, without showing that she noted it, the way his eyes dropped once, briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the folder she was carrying before returning to her face. He knew she had something. She didn't know yet whether that meant he had something to hide, or whether it meant he was simply the kind of experienced executive advisor who reads incoming information in the postures of the people carrying it. She filed the observation and sat down. Adrian introduced her with the economy of a man who understands that over-explaining a position creates the appearance of uncertainty about it. Naomi Mercer, Chief Financial Strategist. She'll be briefing the board on findings from her initial financial review. She presented for 22 minutes. She had constructed the presentation to be precise, sequential, and entirely without rhetorical softening, not to be provocative, but because she had found over the years that rhetorical softening was almost always used to protect the speaker from the discomfort of the audience rather than to serve the actual communication, and she was not in this boardroom to manage anyone's discomfort. The findings were what they were: $40+ million, 11 subsidiaries, 4 years minimum, fictitious vendors, sophisticated concealment, external audits that had failed to detect it for reasons not yet determined. By the time she finished, the room had the particular quality of silence that follows the delivery of information that reorganizes the territory everyone was standing on. She could feel the different textures of it, the genuine shock of some board members, the calculated stillness of others who were already running contingencies, and from Malcolm Pierce's direction, something she couldn't yet name precisely. Not panic, not guilt, but a kind of heightened watchfulness, an almost physical increase in attention, the way a person leans forward slightly when something on a screen concerns them. Board member Randall Fitch spoke first. He was 64, had been on the Vale board for 11 years, and had the blunt entitlement of a man who has chaired enough rooms to believe that tone is a form of authority. This is a significant set of allegations, he said, not to Naomi, but to Adrian. I'd want to understand the verification process before we treat this as established fact. They're findings, Naomi said, not allegations. The documentation is in the appendix. Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man who does not enjoy being corrected by people he has decided not to take seriously. I understand that. I'm questioning the methodology. Then question the methodology in the appendix, she said. The verification is documented on pages 14 through 31. Each identified discrepancy includes the source record, the cross-reference database, and the reconciliation path. If there's a specific finding you'd like to dispute, I'm happy to walk through it line by line. The quality of quiet in the room changed again. She was aware of Adrian at the head of the table, and she was aware, without looking at him, that he was not intervening. Fitch did not pursue it further. He settled back in his chair with the expression of a man saving his position for a different moment. Malcolm Pierce spoke for the first time. His voice was even, considered, and entirely without the bristle that Fitch's had carried. Naomi, the work is clearly thorough. What I'd want to understand is the timeline for completing the full subsidiary review, and whether you've identified any individuals within the organization who appear connected to the transactions. She looked at him steadily. The subsidiary review will be complete within 3 weeks. On your second question, not yet. That's the next phase of the investigation. He nodded slowly. And you'll bring your findings directly to Adrian as they develop? That's correct. Good, he said simply and sat back. She thought about his question for the rest of the day. It was the right question to ask, professionally. The appropriate advisory concern of a senior executive managing a sensitive investigations information flow. It was also, she noted, a question that established clearly that he would know, in advance, when she was getting close to names. She went back through the Meridian files that night. Then she went back through the commission records for the external audits, which Adrian had sent to her without comment at 6 p.m. The record showed that Malcolm Pierce had recommended the selection of the audit firms in all 3 instances, had approved the scope of the audit engagements, and had signed off on the final reports. None of that was necessarily significant. It was exactly the kind of oversight function a senior executive advisor was supposed to perform. The problem was the scope limitations. Specifically, the fact that in all 3 external audits, the scope agreements explicitly excluded a category of accounts described in the documentation as regional subsidiary operational support accounts, which was, Naomi understood immediately when she read it, the precise account classification under which every fraudulent payment she had found was categorized. She sat with the scope limitation documents for a long time. She read them 3 times. Then she read Malcolm Pierce's sign-off memo on each one, which had described the excluded accounts as operationally immaterial to the enterprise-level audit objective. A characterization that was technically defensible if you did not know what was in those accounts, and technically indefensible if you did. She did not yet know which category Malcolm Pierce fell into, but she knew that the person who had written the scope limitations understood precisely what they were excluding, and she knew that the person who had approved those limitations had either understood the same thing or had been deceived by someone who did. Both possibilities were bad. One of them was considerably worse. She called Adrian at 9:47 p.m. He answered on the second ring. I found something else, she said. A pause. How bad? I don't know yet, but I need the original engagement letters for all 3 external audits, the ones Malcolm Pierce countersigned before the scope agreements were finalized. Another pause, longer this time. She could hear, in the quality of it, the weight of what she was asking him to consider. Naomi. His voice was careful. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying the audit scope exclusions were drafted in a way that protected specific accounts from scrutiny. I'm saying those exclusions were approved by one person, and I'm saying I need to see what was agreed to before those exclusions appeared in the final scope documents. The line was quiet. I'll have them to you in the morning, he said. She was in the office at 6:15 a.m. when the documents arrived in her secure file portal. She read them with the specific, merciless attention she brought to things she already half understood and was afraid she was about to understand completely. The original engagement letters contained no account exclusions. The scope was broad, comprehensive, and would have covered every account category that the fraudulent payments ran through. The exclusions had been added, in writing with specific account classification language, between the original engagement letter and the finalized scope agreement in a revision cycle that had bypassed the standard legal review process. Each revision had been submitted directly by Malcolm Pierce's office. She sat in her chair in the early morning quiet of the 35th floor and looked at what she had, and for the first time since she had walked into that conference room at Hargrove and Sloan 3 weeks ago, she felt the actual scale of it settle onto her. This was not an opportunistic fraud by a mid-level finance manager who had found a gap in the controls. This was an architecture, a deliberate, carefully maintained structure built over years by someone with deep institutional knowledge of how the company's financial oversight functioned, and the access and authority to shape that oversight to leave specific blind spots exactly where they were needed. The question of whether Malcolm Pierce had built that architecture himself or had protected it on behalf of someone else was still open, but the question of whether he had known it existed had just closed. She was still sitting with the documents when her office phone rang. It was the main reception desk downstairs. "Miss Mercer, there's a gentleman here asking to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. He says his name is Victor Cross." She had heard the name. Everyone in the New York financial world had heard the name. Victor Cross was 58 years old, a billionaire real estate and infrastructure developer whose company, Cross Capital Group, had been Vail Global's most aggressive competitor for international logistics infrastructure contracts for the past decade. He was known for his intelligence, his appetite, and his complete indifference to the social protocols that govern how powerful people treat people they have decided are beneath them. She had not yet had cause to think about him in relation to the fraud investigation. Now she was thinking about him. "Send him up," she said. He arrived in her doorway 4 minutes later, a large man, not in the soft way of men who have grown comfortable, but in the dense, deliberate way of someone who has always occupied space aggressively and has never seen a reason to stop. He was dressed in a way that communicated very clearly that he had not dressed to impress her, and he looked around her office once with the fast, dismissive survey of someone who has already decided what kind of person they're dealing with. "Miss Mercer," he said. He did not offer his hand. "Victor Cross." "I know who you are," she said. "Sit down." He sat, but in the way that made clear he was choosing to sit rather than being directed to. "I'll keep it simple," he said. "You've been in this building 3 weeks, and already you've managed to create a great deal of disruption in places where people were perfectly comfortable before. I want to understand what you're after." "I'm after accurate financial records," she said. He smiled. It did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "That's a very clean answer." "It's the only answer." "Here's the thing about clean answers," Cross said, leaning forward slightly, his elbows on the edge of her desk in a way that was clearly calibrated as a territorial gesture. "They're usually for people who don't understand how things actually work. You found some accounting irregularities. Happens in companies this size. The question is what you do with them, and who you do it for, and whether the people who've been managing this company's relationships for 20-plus years are going to be treated like criminals because a new hire decided to make a name for herself." She looked at him. She let the silence run for 3 full seconds before she spoke. "Mr. Cross," she said, "you've just told me several important things without meaning to. You know the specifics of what I found, which means someone inside this company has shared privileged investigation information with you. You've come here personally rather than through your legal team, which means you're trying to assess how much I know without creating a documented record of your interest. And you've framed financial fraud as an accounting irregularity, which tells me either that you have your own exposure in this or that you're protecting someone who does." She paused. "Which one is it?" The smile disappeared. Cross stood up slowly. The pleasantness was gone entirely, and what was underneath it was something older and harder and considerably less managed. "You're very smart," he said. "People have told Adrian that, and now I've seen it for myself. Smart can be an asset." He straightened his jacket. "It can also make you a very specific kind of target." He left. She sat in the empty office and heard her own breathing, steady, controlled, the way she had trained herself to breathe in the moments after something alarming, because alarmed breathing announces itself, and she had never wanted to announce herself to anyone who was watching. She picked up her phone and called Adrian. "Victor Cross just left my office," she said when he answered. A silence that was different from the earlier ones, tighter, with an edge in it. "He came to you directly?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "He knows what I found. He knows the specifics. He came to assess my position and deliver a warning." Another silence. Then, "Someone told him." "Yes," she said. From inside the company. Yes. She heard him exhale, not dramatically, just the careful release of a breath held slightly too long. Malcolm. She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. They had both just arrived at the same place from different directions, and the place they had arrived at had no comfortable interpretation. Adrian, she said, I need you to listen to me carefully. What I've found is no longer just a financial fraud investigation. Someone inside Vale Global has been feeding information about this investigation to your primary competitor. That means whoever built this fraud scheme is not simply protecting money. They are actively working to direct a hostile intelligence operation against your company in real time while I'm investigating it. She stopped. Then, and they know I'm getting close. The silence on the line was the longest yet. When Adrian spoke, his voice had the quality of something that has stopped pretending to be anything other than what it is. What do you need? He said. She looked at the document on her screen. The revised audit scope, Malcolm Pierce's signature, the precise and surgical exclusion of exactly the accounts where $40 million had gone to disappear. I need 3 days, she said, and I need you to act completely normal with Malcolm until I tell you otherwise. And after 3 days? She thought about Victor Cross's eyes when the pleasantness had left them. She thought about what it meant that he had come here himself, to this office, to look at her directly. After 3 days, she said, either I have everything we need to take this to federal prosecutors, or whoever is running this inside your company will know exactly how close I am, and they will move first. The 3 days she had asked for compressed into something that felt less like time and more like pressure. The kind that builds in the chest when you're moving fast through a space that's getting smaller, and you can feel the walls but can't yet see them. She slept 4 hours the first night, 3 the second. On the third night, she did not sleep at all. The work was the kind she did best and hated most, the archaeology of a long, careful crime, digging through layers of documentation that had been specifically constructed to resist exactly the kind of digging she was doing. The fraudulent vendor network was more sophisticated than she had initially mapped. It wasn't just 3 shell companies in the Meridian subsidiaries. It was 11, distributed across 7 jurisdictions, each one connected to the others through a chain of nominee directors and registered agents that had been deliberately obscured through regular restructuring. Each company dissolved and replaced on a rolling 18-month cycle, just frequently enough to disrupt any continuity analysis that wasn't looking for the pattern specifically. She was looking for the pattern specifically. By the end of the second day, she had traced the money through 4 layers of corporate structure to a holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands, Alderton Capital Partners. It appeared nowhere in Vale Global's official records. It appeared in no public database she had access to. What it appeared in was the wire transfer records of the nominee bank accounts, as the ultimate beneficiary of every transaction she had identified. She ran Alderton Capital Partners through every private intelligence database her Vale Global credentials could access. Then she called in a favor from a forensic investigator she had worked with once, years ago, at Hargrove and Sloan, a woman named Priya Solis, who operated an independent financial intelligence practice out of a converted loft in Brooklyn, and who had, over 15 years, built the kind of contacts in corporate registry offices across multiple jurisdictions that cannot be bought and can barely be earned. Priya called back at 11:40 p.m. on the second night. Alderton Capital Partners, Priya said, without preamble. Cayman registration, nominee directors, standard offshore architecture. But the beneficiary disclosure filing, which you wouldn't find in any normal database because it was filed under a regulatory amendment that most search engines don't index, lists 2 beneficial owners. Naomi had her pen in her hand. Tell me. The first is a Delaware trust entity called the Whitmore Family Trust, established 14 years ago. I can't get the trust beneficiaries without a court order, but the trustee of record is a law firm called Garrison, Polk and Associates, which is a private wealth management legal practice that does work almost exclusively for high net worth individuals, Naomi said. Specifically individuals connected to the New York real estate and infrastructure development sector, Priya said. Victor Cross has used that same law firm for 3 separate offshore entities in the last 8 years. Naomi wrote it down. Her hand was steady. And the second beneficial owner? A pause on the line. A short one, but the kind that carries weight. The second beneficial owner, Priya said carefully, is listed as a natural person. The name on the filing is Malcolm Pierce. Naomi set her pen down. She did not say anything for a moment. She sat in the silence of the 35th floor at midnight, the city doing its nocturnal business 40 stories below, and she let the shape of what she was now holding arrange itself in her mind with the cold, unflinching clarity that she had spent 30 years developing as a survival mechanism. Malcolm Pierce was not protecting someone else's fraud. He was a co-owner of the vehicle receiving the stolen money. He had been, for at least 4 years, actively looting the company he was paid to advise, in partnership with the company's primary competitor, while simultaneously controlling the audit processes that should have detected it. And he had been doing it for longer than 4 years, she was now certain. The sophistication of the structure, the layering, the rolling entity replacements, the scope exclusions embedded in audit engagement letters. This was not the architecture of a scheme built in haste or in a moment of opportunism. This had been designed deliberately, patiently, and by someone who understood corporate financial oversight from the inside. 22 years, Adrian had said. Malcolm Pierce had been with the company 22 years. She thought about the number and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear and was not quite anger, but existed in the specific register between them where the most dangerous decisions get made. She called Adrian at 12:07 a.m. He answered immediately, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. Malcolm Pierce is a beneficial owner of the Cayman entity receiving the stolen funds, she said. He's been co-looting the company with Victor Cross for at minimum 4 years, and structurally likely longer. I have documentary evidence from Cayman regulatory filings. It's solid. The silence on his end lasted 6 seconds. She counted. Say that again, he said. His voice was very quiet. She said it again. She heard his breathing change, not dramatically, just the slight shift that happens when someone absorbs a blow they were partly braced for and discovers that bracing doesn't actually help. How certain are you? The beneficial ownership filing is a regulatory document. It's not circumstantial. His name is on it. Another silence. Longer. Adrian, she kept her voice level. I need you to tell me you haven't given Malcolm any indication of where the investigation has reached. I haven't, he said. I've been completely normal with him, like you asked. Good. I need one more day to package this for federal submission. I want the SEC and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit briefed simultaneously so there's no window for tomorrow, he said. I need you in the office at 7 a.m. Don't tell anyone else. Not legal, not compliance, not your assistant, just you and me. 7 a.m., he said. She ended the call and went back to the documents. She worked until 4:30, building the evidentiary package with the methodical care of someone who understands that the quality of the documentation is the difference between a prosecution that holds and one that dissolves under a defense attorney's first motion. Every finding sourced to a primary document, every inference supported by at least 2 independent data points, every chain of custody noted. At 4:32 a.m., her secure file portal showed a login notification. She looked at it. A document access event. Someone had opened the main investigation file folder she had been building in the company's secure document management system. The access timestamp was 4:31 a.m. The user credential attached to the access event was her own. She had not opened that folder at 4:31 a.m. She had been working in a separate spreadsheet application. She stared at the notification for 3 seconds. Then she opened the system access log and ran a query on her credential usage for the past 72 hours. The log returned 31 access events, 29 of which she recognized as her own activity, distributed normally across her working hours. The other 2 were not hers. The first was at 2:17 a.m. 2 nights ago. The second was the 4:31 a.m. event she had just seen. Both showed her credential accessing the investigation file folder, downloading documents, and then she checked the download log, transferring them to an external file share address she did not recognize. Someone had cloned her access credentials. Someone had been inside her investigation files for at least 48 hours. She sat very still for a moment. Her hands were flat on the desk. She was aware of the particular quality of the silence around her, the empty building, the middle-of-the-night stillness that had, in the space of reading a log file, transformed from solitude into exposure. Everything she had built, every document, every analysis, Every step of the evidentiary chain she had been constructing for a federal submission, whoever had her credentials had it all. They knew what she knew. They knew what she was planning, and they had known it, at minimum, for 48 hours. She needed to think. She needed to think faster than she had ever thought in her life, and she needed to do it without access to the files she could no longer trust were secure, and without the ability to communicate on any channel that ran through Veil Global's systems. She picked up her personal phone, not the company phone, and called Adrian on his personal number. He answered in 2 rings. "Naomi, don't use the company systems," she said. "Not email, not the secure portal, nothing that runs on Veil Global infrastructure. Someone has cloned my access credentials. They've had my investigation files for 48 hours. A sharp intake of breath. Then, "Malcolm. Has to be. He has the system's access to do it, and he knows what I'm looking for." She was already moving as she spoke, pulling her personal laptop out of her bag, the one she used for nothing connected to Veil Global, the one with no company credentials and no system integrations. "Adrian, they know the federal submission is coming. They're going to move before I can file." Move how? She thought about it. She thought about what she would do, in their position, with 48 hours of advance warning and the resources that Malcolm Pierce and Victor Cross together could deploy. She thought about the specific vulnerability of an investigation that exists, at this moment, only in digital documents stored on a compromised system, documents that could be altered, deleted, or most dangerously, used preemptively. "They're going to use what they took," she said. "They have my analysis, my findings, every document with my name on it. They're going to reconstruct it as a different story. Instead of Malcolm Pierce stealing from Veil Global, they're going to build a narrative where someone manufactured evidence against him." She stopped. "And the person who manufactured the evidence is me." The silence on the line was the worst one yet. "That's insane," Adrian said, but his voice had the sound of someone saying a thing they know isn't sufficient. "Is it?" she said. "Think about what they have. My credential accessing files in the middle of the night, downloads to external addresses, an investigation that exists entirely in digital form on a system they control, a new hire with no tenure, no relationships in the company, who arrived and immediately started pointing at a 22-year executive." She let that sit for a second. "It's not insane. It's actually very clean." He was quiet. "Adrian?" Her voice was as steady as she could make it. "I need you to hear me. When you walk into that building this morning, it's possible that Malcolm has already moved. It's possible that there are people waiting to present you with exactly that narrative, that I fabricated the evidence, that I was working with a competitor, that the fraud isn't real or is substantially different from what I found. And I need you to understand, before that happens, that everything I've told you is documented in primary sources that exist outside Veil Global's systems, because I have been maintaining a parallel record on my personal device since day 4. She heard him exhale. "You were already planning for this," he said. "I was planning for the possibility that someone inside the company would try to interfere with the investigation. I didn't know it would be this fast or this direct, but yes." "The parallel record," he said. "It's complete?" "Complete enough to hand to federal investigators as a standalone evidentiary package. What I need is 24 hours to rebuild the submission from the clean copy and file it before they can execute whatever they're planning." A pause. "Do you have 24 hours?" It was the question she had been not asking herself since 4:32 a.m. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That depends on how fast they move and what they've already set in motion." She found out 3 hours later. She had gone home, showered, changed, and returned to the office by 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Adrian was scheduled to arrive, enough time to sit at her desk and think through the sequence of what needed to happen and in what order. The building was quiet at that hour, only the overnight security staff and the early arriving operations team on the lower floors. Her office door was unlocked. She had locked it when she left at 5 a.m. She was certain of that the way she was certain of details that mattered, absolutely and without qualification. She pushed it open. Malcolm Pierce was sitting in the chair across from her desk. He was wearing a suit. He looked like he had slept. Beside him stood a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, watchful, with the specific physical composure of someone whose professional life has involved managing physical situations. Behind her, she heard the door close. She turned. A second man she didn't recognize was standing between her and the door. Malcolm Pierce looked at her with the gray, careful eyes that she had been reading for weeks, and said, in the same even, unhurried voice he used in boardrooms, "Sit down, Naomi." She did not sit down. She stood in the center of her own office and looked at him and kept her breathing even by an act of will that cost her more than she would have admitted to anyone. "You cloned my credentials," she said. "Sit down," he said again. "You've been in my files." I said, "Sit down." The evenness was the same, but something underneath it had shifted. The particular quality of a man who is past the point of pretending the conversation has more than one possible shape. She sat. Not because he told her to, because she needed to think, and thinking required stillness, and stillness required a chair. "You've been building a federal case," Malcolm said, "against me, against you and Victor Cross, and anyone else whose name is on the Alderton Capital beneficial ownership filing." Something moved across his face, fast, almost invisible, the micro-expression of a man recalibrating. He had not expected her to have Alderton. She could see that, and she filed it, because the fact that it surprised him meant he had not gotten everything from her compromised files. Either the Alderton documentation had been in a different location, or Priya Solis's name appeared nowhere in the documents he'd accessed. "Here's what's going to happen," Malcolm said. He leaned forward slightly, his hands loosely linked in front of him. The posture, she thought, of a man who is accustomed to delivering outcomes that are not negotiable. "You're going to give me every copy of every document you've assembled. Personal device, cloud storage, everything. You're going to send a retraction memo to Adrian this morning stating that your initial findings were based on a misinterpretation of the account structures and require substantial revision. And you're going to resign your position at Vale Global effective today, citing personal reasons. Abait ashumam masketo." She looked at him. "And in return," he said, "you leave this building and you don't hear from us again." The silence in the office was complete. She was aware of the man standing behind her, say, his position, his distance, the particular quality of stillness that meant readiness. She was aware of the second man beside Malcolm, who had not moved and was not going to move unless he was told to. She was aware that she was in a room with people who had spent 22 years operating inside a very large amount of money, and had, in that time, made the decisions that people make when that much money needs protecting. She thought about Victor Cross in this same chair 3 weeks ago. She thought about the way the pleasantness had left his face when she had named what he was doing. She looked at Malcolm Pierce and said, "No." The word landed in the room and sat there. Malcolm's expression did not change. He looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that had been watching rooms for 61 years, and she could see him making a calculation. Not a panicked one, but a methodical one. The arithmetic of a man who is prepared for this specific variable. "Naomi," he said, "you're a very intelligent woman. I think you understand that being intelligent in this situation is not the same as being protected." "I understand that," she said. "Then you understand that the documentation you've assembled exists on systems that are no longer secure to you. That the case you think you're building can be reconstructed as something significantly different. That by the time you reach any federal investigator, there will already be a prior narrative in place that is considerably more difficult to overcome than you're estimating." "You're going to frame me," she said. "I'm going to give you the opportunity to leave cleanly," he said. "What happens if you don't take that opportunity is a function of your choice." She sat in her chair in her locked office, with 2 men between her and the exit, and looked at the 61-year-old man who had just told her, in the careful language of someone who has never needed to raise his voice, that she had already lost. She thought about the parallel files on her personal laptop, which was in her bag, which was on the floor beside her chair. She thought about Priya Solis, who had Alderton Capital on her end, and whose involvement existed nowhere in the documents Malcolm had accessed. She thought about the federal submission she had been 48 hours from completing. She thought about Adrian Vale, who was due in the building in 11 minutes. She thought about the fact that she was sitting here in this room while the building was still mostly empty and Adrian was still outside, and the single most dangerous thing that could happen right now was for Adrian to walk in and be managed by Malcolm before she could reach him. Her phone was in her bag beside the laptop. Her bag was on the floor beside her chair. The man behind her was 3 steps away. Malcolm Pierce looked at her with the patience of a man who has decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the other person to arrive at the same conclusion. You have about 2 minutes to decide, he said. She looked back at him and thought, 11 minutes. She thought, I need 8 of them. She thought about the building she was sitting in, its systems, its infrastructure, the emergency protocols she had read in the company security manual during her first week. Because she read everything, because reading everything was the habit that had gotten her this far and was going to have to get her further, she thought about what she needed to do in the next 60 seconds. And whether she could do it without the man behind her stopping her. And she decided that the answer depended entirely on whether she could make the next 10 seconds look like something other than what they were going to be. She let her shoulders drop. She let her hands come together in her lap. She looked at Malcolm Pierce with the expression of a woman who has just done the arithmetic and arrived at the conclusion he was waiting for. All right, she said quietly. His shoulders released, barely, almost imperceptibly, but she saw it. She reached down for her bag. The bag was on the floor beside her left foot, the laptop inside it, the phone inside it, 11 years of professional discipline. Inside it, compressed into the single most important 60 seconds of her life. She reached down slowly. Compliance posture. Shoulders curved inward, eyes down. The physical vocabulary of a person who has just made the decision to stop fighting. She had watched enough people make that decision in professional settings to know exactly what it looked like from the outside, and she reproduced it with the precision of someone who has spent 30 years being underestimated and has finally found a use for it. Her right hand found the bag strap. Her left hand, lower, fingers brushing the floor, found the side pocket zipper. The small one, the one that held her personal phone, the one she could open by feel because she had opened it 10,000 times without looking. The zipper moved 3 inches before the man behind her shifted his weight. She heard the floor take it, a single creak, barely audible, but the building was quiet enough at 6:50 a.m. that it registered. She did not stop moving. She pulled the phone free with 2 fingers, kept it below the desk line, kept her eyes on Malcolm Pierce with the expression of a woman sorting through her bag for a document she was about to surrender. The files are on the laptop, she said. Her voice was flat, emptied of everything except the performance of compliance. I'll need a minute to pull them up. Malcolm watched her. His gray eyes were patient and entirely without warmth. Take your time, he said. She thumbed the phone screen on in her lap. No passcode. She had disabled it that morning, a decision she had not consciously made, but which some operational part of her brain had apparently arrived at while the rest of her was focused on other things. The screen lit against her thigh. She knew the Veil Global Emergency Security Protocol by memory. She had read it twice during her first week, not because she expected to use it, but because she read everything and the things she read stayed in her, organized and retrievable, filed in the precise mental architecture she had spent 30 years building. Emergency lockdown initiation required a 6-digit code entered through the building management app, which was on her personal phone because she had downloaded every Veil Global operational system to both devices on her first day. She opened the app with her thumb. 4 taps to the emergency section. 6 digits. Her employee number, which she had memorized the day the badge arrived. She pressed confirm. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the building spoke. Not loudly, not the screaming klaxon of a fire alarm, nothing that dramatic. The Veil Global Smart Building System's emergency lockdown protocol expressed itself first as a shift in the lighting. Every fluorescent overhead on floors 34 through 38 dropping simultaneously to 40%, replacing their flat white light with the slightly amber security tint that indicated restricted access mode. Then the electronic locks on every stairwell door and elevator engaging, a sound that traveled through the building's frame as a low, collective thunk felt more than heard, like the building taking a single deep breath and holding it. Then every screen in the building, every monitor, every digital display, every smart glass partition, illuminated with the same message. Security protocol active. Building in restricted access mode. All personnel remain in place. Security response inbound. Malcolm Pierce's head came up. The man behind Naomi moved toward her, and she was already moving. Not away from him, which was what he expected, but sideways and forward, rolling her chair hard into the desk to create a barrier, coming up on her feet on the far side of the desk from where he'd been standing, putting the desk between herself and both men while Malcolm was still processing the lights. "What did you do?" Malcolm said. Not a question. The evenness in his voice had cracked, not broken, just fractured, a hairline split in 61 years of composure. "Building lockdown," she said. She had her phone in her hand now, visible, and she was already moving to the corner of the office furthest from the door. The corner with the ventilation panel, the one she had noted during her second week when she had read the building's emergency infrastructure documentation. Because, again, she read everything. Security response is automated. They'll be on this floor in under 4 minutes. The man who had been behind her was around the desk now, between her and the door. The second man was standing, watching Malcolm for direction. Malcolm Pierce stood up. Something had happened to his face. The careful blankness was still there in its architecture, but underneath it something older had surfaced, something that had been there long before the boardrooms and the suites and the 22 years of managed loyalty. He looked at her across the width of the office with eyes that had stopped calculating and started simply seeing, and what they were seeing was a problem that had just changed its shape entirely. "The lockdown doesn't help you," he said. "Security arrives, they find you in a room with 2 of my associates. I explained that you had a breakdown, that you activated the protocol without cause. The retraction memo goes out under your name regardless." "Under my name from a system you've already compromised," she said. "Which is why I drafted it on a platform that logs creation metadata independently of Veil Global's infrastructure, and which is why the timestamp will show it was created while I was in a locked room with 2 men who don't work for this company." She looked at him steadily. "You cloned my credentials on the company system. You didn't clone my personal accounts. Every document I built in the last 72 hours from the clean parallel record exists on servers you don't have access to, and the creation data for all of it will show very clearly that I was not alone when I created it." The man closest to her took a step forward. "Don't," she said, not loudly, but with the specific quality of someone who means it in a way that doesn't require volume. He stopped. Not because of her, because Malcolm Pierce had raised one hand, barely, a gesture so small it was almost invisible, and the man read it and stopped. Malcolm was looking at her with the gray eyes and the fractured composure, and something that she recognized after a moment as the expression of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. "You planned this," he said. "I planned for the possibility that someone would try to remove me from the building before I could complete the federal filing," she said. "I didn't know it would be you personally. That's actually useful information." "You don't have a federal filing," he said. "You have documents on a personal device that no one has authenticated, built by an investigator who's been in the company for less than a month, who is currently activating emergency protocols without authorization, and who, as of this morning, is the subject of an internal misconduct review initiated by this office yesterday afternoon." She felt that one land. She absorbed it without showing that she absorbed it. "You filed misconduct yesterday at 4 p.m. through HR, citing improper access to confidential personnel files and unauthorized external communication of privileged financial information." He straightened his jacket. "By the time you reach anyone in the federal system, there will already be an active internal HR process with my name on it and yours as the subject. The narrative is already moving, Naomi. You're trying to catch up to it." The lights stayed amber. Somewhere in the building's lower levels, she could hear the elevator system responding to the lockdown. The cars returning to the lobby, the shafts going quiet. 3 minutes, maybe less, before security reached this floor. She thought about what he had just said and found, in the center of it, the thing that was wrong. "You filed it yesterday at 4 p.m., she said. "That's what I said." "Yesterday at 4 p.m., I hadn't yet found the Alderton Capital Beneficial Ownership filing. I found it at 11:40 last night from a source external to Veil Global Systems." She looked at him. "If you filed misconduct yesterday at 4 p.m., you filed it before you knew how close I was to Alderton, which means you didn't file it in response to the investigation. You filed it preemptively." She paused. "Which means you've been planning this removal since before you knew what I had. Which means the decision to remove me wasn't triggered by the investigation, it was triggered by something else." She watched his face. "Victor Cross called you after he left my office," she said. 3 weeks ago. And you decided then." The arithmetic she saw him doing behind the gray eyes was no longer the calm arithmetic of a man managing a situation. It was the faster, more desperate calculation of someone who has just realized that the variable they underestimated has been running a parallel analysis the entire time. The stairwell door at the end of the hall opened. She heard it through the walls, the magnetic lock releasing for an authorized security credential, the heavy door swinging, footsteps on the landing. And underneath those sounds, closer, the elevator chime she had been counting toward for the last 4 minutes, the executive elevator, the one that required a level 5 badge to operate after hours, arriving on 35 with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The office door opened. Adrian Vale walked in. He took in the room in less than 2 seconds. The amber light, Malcolm standing beside the desk, the 2 men she didn't know, Naomi in the corner with her phone in her hand, and his face did the thing that faces do when the thing you were warned might be happening turns out to be exactly what is happening. "Malcolm," he said. His voice was absolutely level. Malcolm turned. Something happened in his posture. Not a flinch, nothing that overt, but the slight reorganization of a man who has just had the geometry of the room change in a way that forces a recalibration. "Adrian, I'm glad you're here. Naomi has activated the building emergency protocol without authorization. We were in the middle of discussing the Alderton Capital Partners beneficial ownership filing," Adrian said, "which has your name on it. As co-beneficiary of the vehicle that received $42 million stolen from my company over the last 4 years. The silence in the room was total. Malcolm Pierce looked at Adrian Vale for a long moment. The gray eyes were very still. When he spoke, his voice was almost exactly what it had always been. Almost, except for the thing underneath it that had been there since the lights changed, and that was now, for the first time, audible. "You don't understand what you're looking at," Malcolm said. "Tell me what I'm looking at," Adrian said. "Something that was built to protect this company, in ways that you were never supposed to need to know about." He took a breath. "Adrian, there are relationships in this company's operational history that have always required a certain kind of management that doesn't appear in financial statements. The money you think was stolen was operational. It was maintaining relationships that kept Vale Global's contracts intact in markets where contracts don't survive without $42 million, Adrian said, in shell companies, with your name on the receiving entity. And Victor Cross." "Adrian, Victor Cross." His voice was still level, but there was something under it now, something that had been building since 11:40 p.m. when Naomi had called him with Malcolm's name, and that had spent the intervening hours being held down by the discipline of a man who had decided not to feel it until he was in the same room as the person it was about. "You've been working with Victor Cross for 4 years, Victor Cross, who has been trying to take contracts from this company in every market we operate in, who underbid us on the Rotterdam facility, who cost us the Singapore expansion, who I have sat across from in negotiating rooms while you were sitting beside me." He stopped. "Were you feeding him our numbers?" Malcolm Pierce said nothing. "Were you feeding him our bid numbers, Malcolm?" The silence was its own answer. Adrian Vale's jaw set. She watched it happen, the specific muscular event of a man deciding what he is going to be in this moment, what he will allow himself and what he will not. He looked at Malcolm Pierce for 5 seconds with the expression of someone reading a document they have been shown and cannot dispute, and then he looked away. "Get them out of my building," he said to the security team that had arrived in the doorway. One of the unnamed men moved first, the one who had been between Naomi and the door. He moved toward the exit, and the 2 security officers in the doorway shifted to intercept him, and he stopped, and the calculation he did was fast and visible and arrived at the only sensible conclusion. Malcolm Pierce did not move toward the door. He stood beside the desk and looked at Adrian Vale with the gray eyes and the fractured composure and said quietly, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Adrian said. "You can't prove the misconduct filing was retaliatory. The HR process is already active. She's already the subject of an investigation. By the time your lawyers get through the internal review, she filed with the SEC and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit at 6:03 this morning," Adrian said. "From a personal device, on a personal network, using documentation maintained independently of Vale Global Systems. Your HR filing was time-stamped 4 p.m. yesterday. Hers was 6:03 today." He paused. "The sequence is on record." Malcolm Pierce went very still. "You told her to file this morning?" he said. "She told me to stay out of her way," Adrian said. "I stayed out of her way." Naomi's phone buzzed in her hand. She looked at the screen. A confirmation receipt from the SEC's electronic filing system, time-stamped and case-numbered. The automated response to the submission she had completed at 6:03 a.m. from her kitchen table on her personal laptop, using the personal Wi-Fi network that had nothing to do with Vail Global's infrastructure and everything to do with 11 days of invisible work that had become 3 weeks of increasingly dangerous visibility. She looked at Malcolm Pierce. He was looking back at her with something she had not seen in his face before. Not the gray composure, not the careful watchfulness, not the arithmetic of a man managing outcomes. What she saw instead was the specific expression of someone who has just understood fully and without any remaining ambiguity that they have lost. "You had it ready," he said. Not to Adrian, to her. "Since 2 a.m., she said. "I was just waiting to confirm you'd made your move first. I needed the sequence in the right order." He stared at her. "You let me come into this office," he said. "You let me threaten you. You sat there and let me lay out the whole thing, the misconduct filing, the narrative, the credential compromise, because you needed me to do it in a room where the building systems were recording." The smart building's security protocol logged all activity in common areas and office spaces during lockdown events. It was in the emergency documentation. Page 12, paragraph 4. She said nothing. Malcolm Pierce looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at his hands. Then he looked at the amber light falling through the windows of the 35th floor office of the woman he had walked into at 6:50 a.m., believing he was ending a problem, and he seemed to understand, in the particular way that men who have operated for a very long time without opposition understand things when they finally encounter it, that what he had walked into instead was the end of himself. The security officers were at his elbows now. He went without resistance, which was the one thing she hadn't predicted, and which struck her, as she watched it happen, as somehow the most chilling part of all of it. The ease with which a man who has operated inside power for 22 years steps outside it, when the power is finally, unmistakably, gone. The door closed. Adrian Vale stood in the empty office and looked at her. The amber light was still on. Somewhere in the building's systems, the lockdown clock was counting toward its automatic 60-minute review, at which point the security protocol would request confirmation to remain active or release. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not relief, not gratitude, not even the raw anger she had heard underneath his voice when he'd said Victor Cross's name. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has just watched something happen that he knows he will be absorbing for a long time. "You used yourself as bait," he said. "I used the situation as it was," she said. "He was going to move regardless. I needed him to move in a way that I controlled. You were alone in this office with two men who... I activated the lockdown before they could do anything," she said. "I had 11 minutes from when I called you to when you arrived. I needed them to stay in the room. The only thing that was going to keep them in the room was if they thought they were winning." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then he did something she had not seen him do in the weeks she had known him. He put both hands over his face and stood there for 3 seconds in the amber light of the lockdown building. And in those 3 seconds, he was not the CEO of a $40 billion logistics company, but simply a man who had just lost something he had trusted for 22 years and had not yet found the frame for it. She let those 3 seconds be what they were. She did not fill them. He lowered his hands. His face had resettled into something harder than it had been before. Not cold, but forged, the expression of a material that has been through heat and come out with a different internal structure. "Cross," he said. "He's not in the building. He'll be served at his offices," she said. The FBI Financial Crimes Referral names him as a co-conspirator. The SEC filing covers the market manipulation implications of the bid information leaks. She paused. "It's going to be a long morning for him." Adrian nodded. He stood with his hands at his sides in the amber light and breathed. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed. Not dramatically, but in the specific way faces change when a number appears that they were not expecting, and the appearance of it means something has moved faster than anticipated. "It's the board chair," he said. She felt something tighten in her chest. "Fitch." "Yes, Randall Fitch, 64 years old, 11 years on the Vail board. The man who had questioned her methodology at the board meeting and had not pursued it when she pushed back by... Not because she had convinced him, she now understood, but because he had decided in that moment that pressing further would reveal too much of what he already knew. Adrian was looking at the phone in his hand with the expression of a man doing very fast arithmetic. "If Fitch is calling right now," she said carefully, "at 6:58 a.m., before the building has formally communicated anything about what just happened, he already knows something happened." Adrian looked at her. "Malcolm," she said. "Malcolm called him before he came up here, told him the plan, told him it was happening this morning." She felt the shape of it assembling. "Adrian, how many board members did Malcolm have?" The phone rang again in his hand. She watched Adrian Vale stand in the amber light of the locked-down building with his board chair calling him at 6:58 in the morning, and she watched him understand, the way she had watched him understand things before, with the same flat, merciless clarity, that the fraud she had uncovered and the conspiracy she had just dismantled in this office were not the whole of what had been built against his company. They were the part that had been meant to be found when the time came. The part that was meant to be found in a way that destroyed Vale Global from the inside before anyone could stop it. His thumb moved to answer the call, and she said, "Wait." He stopped. "Don't answer it," she said. Her mind was moving very fast now, pulling threads, running the sequence forward the way she ran numbers, not to where they were, but to where they were going. If Fitch is in this, answering that call tells him exactly where you are and what you know. Right now, he doesn't know what happened in this room. He doesn't know if Malcolm's plan succeeded or failed. He's calling to find out. Adrian looked at the ringing phone. "The moment you answer," she said, "we lose the only advantage we still have." The phone rang a fourth time, a fifth. Then it stopped. The silence it left behind was the most dangerous silence she had encountered in a building full of dangerous silences, because it meant that somewhere in the city, a man who had just learned that his call had gone unanswered was now making a different calculation than the one he had woken up making, and she did not yet know what that calculation was going to produce. "How many board members?" Adrian said again, quietly. The question had become a different question now. She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said, "but we need to find out before the board meeting at 9 a.m., because if Fitch has the votes—" Adrian's head came up sharply. "There's no board meeting at 9 a.m. She felt something cold move through her. "Your assistant sent a calendar update at 5:50 this morning. Emergency board session, 9 a.m., 36th floor conference room." She had seen it on her company calendar before she'd left for home to shower. She had assumed Adrian had called it. "You didn't schedule it." He stared at her. "Malcolm scheduled it," she said, "before he came up here. He scheduled the emergency board session for 9 a.m. because he expected to have walked out of this office at 7 with my resignation and my retraction, and at 9 a.m. he was going to present the board with a package of manufactured evidence, a signed retraction from the CFO who had been investigating the fraud, and a motion to restructure Vale Global's executive leadership under emergency governance provisions." Adrian said nothing. "He had the votes," she said. "He wouldn't have scheduled the meeting if he didn't have the votes." She looked at the clock on her phone. 6:59 a.m. 2 hours until 9. She looked at Adrian Vale standing in the amber light of the locked-down 35th floor with his board chair's missed call sitting on his phone and a scheduled meeting in 2 hours that had been designed to end his company. And she thought about what they had and what they didn't have, and what 2 hours was enough time to do and what it wasn't, and she made the calculation with everything she had, which was a parallel evidentiary file, a confirmed federal submission, a building security recording of Malcolm Pierce's confession, and one person in this building she was certain she could trust. 2 hours, she said. "Tell me what you need," he said. She was already moving toward the door. 6:59 a.m. She moved fast and she moved clean, the way she had learned to move through problems that had stopped being abstract and become physical. Not running, because running announces panic. And panic is a signal to everyone watching that the person producing it has lost control of the situation. She walked with the focused velocity of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has decided that nothing between here and there is going to matter. The building was still in amber lockdown. That worked in her favor for exactly as long as it took security to complete their floor-by-floor confirmation sweep and release the protocol, which she estimated at 40 to 50 minutes. After that, the building returned to normal access, the elevators reopened, and anyone who had been waiting outside, anyone Fitch had called in the 2 minutes since his missed call had gone unanswered, could come up. She needed the security recording first. The building management office was on 22, staffed during lockdown events by the overnight security supervisor, a man named Torres, who had been running the night desk at Vail Global for 9 years, and who had, during her first week, patiently walked her through the building's emergency system documentation when she had asked to review it. He had seemed mildly surprised that someone from the executive floor wanted to understand the HVAC override protocols and the server room emergency power sequencing, but he had answered every question without requiring a reason for any of them. She took the internal stairwell, unlocked for Vail Global badge holders during lockdown, and descended 13 floors in the amber half-light, her footsteps sharp and regular on the concrete, her breathing controlled, her mind running the sequence forward. What she had: the security recording from her office during the lockdown event, which would contain Malcolm Pierce's voice laying out the entire scheme, the misconduct filing, the credential compromise, the narrative restructuring, the threats. The building system logged audio and video during emergency protocols in all common and executive office spaces, which was disclosed in the employee handbook and which meant it was legally obtained. What she needed: a certified copy of that recording, time-stamped and authenticated by the building management system, before anyone with the administrative access to delete or modify it could be directed to do so by someone who understood what it contained. Torres was at his desk when she pushed through the door into the management office, a compact room of monitors and system terminals that smelled of old coffee and recycled air. He looked up when she came in and registered the amber lighting status on his board and her presence simultaneously. "Ms. Mercer," he said. His voice was careful. "The lockdown event, that was initiated from your credential?" "Yes," she said. "I need the security recording from Office 3517 from 6:40 a.m. to the present. Certified copy, system authenticated, pulled to an external drive that I take with me." He looked at her for a moment. "That normally requires Level 5 authorization," she said. "Adrian Vale's clearance level. He's in the building. Call up to 36 and confirm." Torres reached for his desk phone. He dialed. She stood and listened to him speak, and listened to Adrian's voice on the other end confirm the authorization in 4 words. And then she watched Torres navigate the building management interface with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been running these systems for 9 years and knows every menu without thinking. It took 6 minutes. She watched the progress bar on the extraction terminal and breathed. The drive was in her hand at 7:13 a.m. She took the stairs back up to 35, went to her office, locked the door, connected the drive to her personal laptop, and made 3 copies. One uploaded immediately to a cloud account that had nothing to do with Vail Global, one emailed directly to the lead FBI financial crimes contact she had included in her 6:03 a.m. referral package, and one retained on the drive. Then she opened a new document and started writing. She had 1 hour and 43 minutes before the board meeting that Malcolm Pierce had scheduled to end Vail Global, and she was going to spend the first 45 of them building the most compressed, precise, and irrefutable evidence summary she had ever constructed. Not the full evidentiary package, which was already filed and in federal hands, but a boardroom document, the kind that can be read in 8 minutes by people who are used to making decisions on incomplete information and needs to be clear enough that even the ones who already know the truth can't pretend they don't. She wrote without stopping. Her coffee went cold beside her. The amber light eventually shifted back to white as the lockdown released at 7:51, and the building resumed its normal sounds. Elevators, climate systems, the distant percussion of other people's mornings. She did not look up. At 8:30, she knocked on Adrian's office door. He was at his desk, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled, phone face down in front of him. He had been making calls. She could tell from the set of his shoulders the particular quality of controlled tension that follows a series of conversations that have cost something. She set the document in front of him. 14 pages. He read it in 11 minutes. She stood. When he finished, he looked up. "Fitch has 3 votes," he said. "Not enough for a majority. I've spoken to the other 8 board members this morning. 5 are solid. 2 are waiting to see what happens at 9. 1 isn't answering." "Who isn't answering?" "Patricia Wen." She thought about Patricia Wen, 67 years old, the second longest serving board member after Fitch, a former federal trade commissioner whose reputation for institutional integrity had been one of the things that had made the Vail board credible to external partners for a decade. She had said almost nothing at the initial briefing where Naomi had presented her findings, which Naomi had read at the time as the neutral reserve of someone withholding judgment until the evidence was fully in. She was now reading it differently. "She knew," Naomi said. Adrian looked at her. "You don't know that." She didn't ask a single question at the briefing. Nobody with her background sits through a presentation about $42 million in undetected fraud and asks nothing unless they already know the answers. She paused. Or unless they're afraid of what following up will reveal. He was quiet. "It doesn't change the vote count," she said. 5 solid votes plus yours is a majority. We don't need her. But I want you to know going in that she may not be a neutral party." He nodded once. "All right." She picked up her document. "One more thing," she said. "At 9 a.m., Fitch is going to walk in expecting Malcolm to be in that room. He doesn't yet know that Malcolm left this building in the company of security and 2 FBI agents who arrived at 7:40. She had received the confirmation from her federal contact while she was writing. When he sees Malcolm isn't there, he's going to do one of 2 things. He's going to try to delay the meeting to regroup, or he's going to move immediately and aggressively on whatever plan he has that doesn't require Malcolm to be present. Which is more dangerous? She thought about it honestly. "The second one," she said. "Because the plan that doesn't require Malcolm is the plan that's entirely about discrediting me, and that plan only requires a story and the votes to make the story stick long enough to trigger the emergency governance provisions." Adrian looked at her steadily. "Can he make it stick?" She thought about the misconduct filing sitting in the HR system. She thought about the credential compromise evidence, which existed entirely on Vail Global Systems that Malcolm's people had accessed. She thought about the story from the outside. New hire, 1 month in, junior background, no institutional history, pointing at a 22-year executive with documented credentials and relationships. In the context of an investigation that, to anyone who hadn't seen the primary documents, could be narrated as either discovery or fabrication. "He can make it noisy," she said. "I don't think he can make it stick, but it's going to be an unpleasant hour." She was right on both counts. The boardroom on 36 was a long room with glass on the north wall and a table that seated 14, and at 9:02 a.m. it contained 11 people, 9 board members, Adrian Vail at the head, and Naomi Mercer in the chair at the foot that nobody had assigned her, and that she had simply sat in, placing her document and her personal laptop in front of her with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has decided where they belong. Randall Fitch arrived at 9:03. He came through the door with the momentum of a man who is prepared for a specific situation and stops, almost imperceptibly, when he finds that the situation has rearranged itself. His eyes went to the chair beside Adrian where Malcolm Pierce should have been sitting, and then to Naomi at the far end, and something moved across his face that he recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. He sat down. He opened his folder. He looked at Adrian. "Where is Malcolm?" "Not available," Adrian said. A beat. Fitch recalibrated. She watched it happen. The fast, practiced adjustment of a man who has been in enough rooms to know when the floor has shifted and has learned to find his footing without showing that he's looking for it. "We should reschedule if the executive advisory chair isn't—" "The meeting was called for 9 a.m., Adrian said. "We have quorum. We proceed." Fitch looked around the table. He was reading the room the way she had watched him read rooms. Fast, clinical, tallying. Whatever count he arrived at did not visibly please him, but he was 64 years old and had been on this board for 11 years, and he did not show displeasure visibly. He folded his hands on the table. "Then I'll get to this point," he said. "This board has received through proper HR channels a misconduct complaint against Vail Global's chief financial strategist." He did not look at Naomi. He looked at the center of the table, which was the rhetorical position of someone addressing the room rather than an individual, a technique for making a personal attack appear institutional. Given the seriousness of the allegations, unauthorized system access, improper external disclosure of privileged financial information, and questions about the validity of her investigative methodology, I am moving that we place Ms. Mercer on administrative leave pending a full independent review. and that we suspend the federal referrals she has initiated until that review is complete. He stopped. He let it sit. Naomi did not move. She had her hands flat on the table and her eyes on Fitch, and she breathed at the same rate she had been breathing since she sat down. Board member Susan Park spoke first. She was 59, had joined the board 4 years ago, and had asked the most precise questions at the initial briefing. Randall, the federal referrals were filed at 6 a.m. this morning. They're already in the system. You can't suspend a filing that's already been received by a federal agency. We can issue a clarification that the company is disputing its own CFO's findings, Park said, in the middle of an active federal investigation. That's not a clarification, that's an obstruction. The investigation's validity is precisely what's in question. Then let's talk about validity, Naomi said. The room went quiet. Fitch looked at her for the first time since he'd sat down. She opened her laptop. The misconduct complaint against me was filed yesterday at 4 p.m. by Malcolm Pierce. The primary allegation is unauthorized external disclosure of privileged financial information. She looked up at Fitch. The specific external disclosure cited in the complaint is the Alderton Capital Partners Beneficial Ownership Filing, which is a Cayman Islands regulatory document, available in a public's registry database to any licensed financial investigator with a subscription to the appropriate intelligence platform. She paused. It isn't privileged. It isn't internal. It's a public regulatory filing. Malcolm Pierce's name is on it as co-beneficial owner of the vehicle that received $42 million from Vail Global Accounts. She looked around the table. The misconduct complaint is not describing a violation. It is describing the moment I found evidence of his involvement. Fitch said, you obtained that information through sources that the building security system recorded this morning's conversation in Office 3517, she said. From 6:40 to 7:14 a.m., during the active lockdown protocol. That recording has been authenticated, copied, and transmitted to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit as supplementary evidence. She looked at Fitch steadily. In that recording, Malcolm Pierce outlines the misconduct complaint, the credential compromise, the narrative he intended to present to this board this morning, and the specific threats he made in the event that I refused to sign a retraction and resign. She stopped. I have a copy on this device if the board wishes to hear it. The silence in the boardroom was the kind that Naomi had come to understand as the silence of people who have been in the middle of a story they thought they understood and have just realized they were reading it wrong. Patricia Wen spoke for the first time. Her voice was measured and gave nothing away. How long has the investigation been running? The initial discrepancy identification occurred approximately 6 weeks ago, Naomi said. The full subsidiary review was completed 18 days ago. The federal package was complete and ready to file as of 2 a.m. this morning. And the credential compromise, detected at 4:32 a.m. yesterday. The compromised access occurred on 2 occasions, the first 48 hours prior, the second at the time of detection. Patricia Wen looked at the table. She looked at her own hands. She was a former federal trade commissioner, and she knew exactly what every word Naomi had just said meant in a legal context, and Naomi watched her understand it and watched her do the thing that people with genuine institutional integrity do when the evidence forces a conclusion they would have preferred not to reach. She let it be what it was. I need to recuse myself from the vote, Patricia Wen said quietly. Fitch's head turned toward her sharply. I received a call from Malcolm Pierce at 11 p.m. last night, Wen said. She was looking at Adrian when she said it, not at Fitch, not at Naomi. He told me the investigation had identified irregularities in my personal financial disclosures to the board related to a consulting relationship I held 3 years ago. He said he could manage the situation if I supported the governance motion this morning. She stopped. I didn't agree to anything, but I also didn't report the call, and I should have. She looked at Adrian directly. I'm sorry. The room absorbed it. Fitch looked at the table. The count he had arrived at when he walked in had just lost a piece he'd been counting on to stay neutral, and he was doing the arithmetic in real time, and the arithmetic was arriving somewhere he had not planned to be at 9:07 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Adrian Vail looked at Randall Fitch from the head of the table with the expression of a man who has already made a decision and is waiting for the appropriate moment to deliver it. Randall, he said, Is there anything you want to say before I ask for the vote on your removal from this board? Fitch looked at him. The practiced composure was still there. It had been built over too many years in too many rooms to simply dissolve, and she found herself respecting the architecture of it even while watching it fail. You're making a serious mistake, he said. Tell me what the mistake is, Adrian said. Malcolm Pierce managed relationships in this company that you have never had to think about because he managed them so that you didn't have to. Some of those relationships required arrangements that don't survive full transparency. That's not corruption. That's the difference between a company that operates in the real world and one that operates in a graduate school ethics seminar. He leaned forward slightly. You fire Malcolm, you let this woman hand everything to federal investigators, and you will spend the next 3 years in depositions while your competitors, while Victor Cross, takes every contract you can't service because your operational infrastructure is tied up in discovery requests. The room was very quiet. Victor Cross is being served this morning, Adrian said. His company will be in federal court before noon. He won't be taking contracts from anyone for a considerable period. He looked at Fitch with a steadiness that had nothing performative in it. And the arrangements Malcolm was managing said, the money, the shell companies, the fabricated vendors, that's not operational reality. That's $42 million that belong to this company and to the people who work for it, being stolen over 4 years by a man I trusted. He stopped. There isn't a version of that story where I sit quietly and let it continue because the alternative is complicated. Zum sin. Fitch sat back. He looked at the table. He was 64 years old and he had been in this boardroom for 11 years, and he looked, in this moment, like someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has just been relieved of it in a way that is not at all what relief is supposed to feel like. I'll resign, he said, effective immediately. I won't require a vote. He gathered his folder. He stood. He looked at Naomi once, briefly, with the gray assessment of someone who has spent a career evaluating people and is now evaluating the person who has just ended a chapter of his life. Whatever the assessment was, he kept it. He left. The door closed behind him. The boardroom sat in the specific quiet that follows the exit of something that has been in a room for a long time. 8 board members remained, plus Adrian, plus Naomi, at the foot of the table with her hands flat on the document in front of her and her breathing even, and the fluorescent light of an ordinary Thursday morning falling through the north wall glass onto the table where everything had just resolved. Susan Park said, I move that the administrative misconduct complaint against Naomi Mercer be formally dismissed and expunged from the company record. The vote was 7-0, with Patricia Wen abstaining. The weeks that followed had the quality of an aftermath, the specific landscape of a place where something enormous has happened, and the people moving through it are still oriented to the shape of the thing that's gone, still navigating around the space where it stood. The FBI financial crimes investigation moved with the focused velocity of an agency that had received a well-documented referral and had been waiting, in one form or another, for something like Alderton Capital Partners to surface for years. Malcolm Pierce was arrested at his Westchester home on a Friday morning, 16 days after the boardroom meeting, on charges including wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. His attorney released a statement. Malcolm Pierce released nothing. Victor Cross's situation was more complicated, as situations involving people with Cross's resources and legal infrastructure tend to be. The criminal conspiracy charges required a higher evidentiary threshold than the SEC's civil market manipulation referral, and his attorneys were aggressive and expensive and moved with the speed that aggressive, expensive attorneys move when the alternative is federal prison for their client. The civil case settled in the 4th month. The criminal case was still moving when the season changed. Randall Fitch was not charged with anything. The evidence of what he knew and when he knew, it existed in the negative space of what he had not done, had not reported, had not questioned, had not pursued. And negative space, in a federal court, is considerably harder to prosecute than a name on a Cayman beneficial ownership filing. He returned his board fees for the previous 2 years, through his attorney without comment. He did not otherwise surface. Patricia Wen resigned from the board the day after the boardroom meeting, in a letter that was 3 paragraphs long and said precisely what it needed to say and nothing else. Naomi read it once. She put it in a folder and closed the folder and did not open it again. The Veil Global Internal Reconstruction took the full first month and most of the second. Naomi rebuilt the financial oversight infrastructure from the foundation, new vendor verification protocols, independent external audit firm selection processes with rotating mandatory firm changes every 3 years and no single point of approval authority, real-time subsidiary account monitoring with automated anomaly flagging, and a direct audit reporting line to the board's independent audit committee that bypassed executive management entirely. She documented every change in a framework document that ran to 212 pages, and that she presented to the reconstituted board in a 3-hour session that produced more substantive questions than any meeting she had attended in 7 years at Hargrove and Sloan. The new board members were different from the ones they replaced, not in the simple sense of being better people, but in the more complicated sense of having been selected through a process that had been designed by someone who now understood in extraordinary detail exactly how the previous process had been corrupted. She had written the selection criteria herself at Adrian's request in the second week. She had found, in writing them, that she had more to say about institutional integrity than she had expected, more that was specific and operational and grounded in the experience of having watched integrity fail from close range for a long time. It was in the third month, on a night in late winter when the city outside the 35th floor windows was the particular dark blue that means the temperature has dropped below 20 and the sky has gone clean and hard, that she sat in her office after everyone else had gone home and looked at what was around her. The organized files, the clean desk, the 3 monitors with their orderly data displays, and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. She sat with it for a while. It was not happiness, exactly. It was not relief, which she had expected and which had arrived briefly in the boardroom and departed again almost immediately, as relief tends to do when it discovers that the person it has arrived for is already moving toward the next thing. It was not pride, which she had been offered several times in the past 3 months, in the form of various institutional acknowledgments, in which she had received with the courteous, slightly uncomfortable attention of someone being given a gift they don't quite know where to put. What she felt, sitting in her office in the blue winter dark, was the specific and unglamorous sensation of having arrived somewhere she had been building toward without fully knowing she was building toward it. Not a destination. She was constitutionally unsuited to destinations, which implied stopping, which implied a static relationship with the world that nothing in her experience had ever suggested was possible or desirable. More like a foundation. The thing you build on. The thing that has to be solid before anything else can be real. The knock on her open door was light. She looked up. Adrian Vale was standing in the doorway in his jacket and the slightly disheveled quality he got at the end of long days, holding 2 cups of coffee from the third-floor kitchen with the particular awareness of a man who has learned, over 3 months of working very close to someone, that she drinks it black and that offering it is one of the few gestures she will accept without immediately deflecting. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Fitch's attorney called my office today," he said. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, not the chair Malcolm Pierce had sat in on that amber-lit morning, which had been replaced in the second week, but the chair that had been there before any of this, the one that had a slight wobble in its left rear leg that she had been meaning to report to facilities for 3 months. "What did he want?" she said. "To make sure we weren't planning additional civil action." He set one of the cups in front of her. "I told him we weren't." She looked at the cup. "Are we?" "We could," he said, "but I don't think you want to spend another year in depositions." She didn't. No. He held his own cup in both hands. Outside, the city was its enormous self, indifferent, continuous, unreduced by anything that had happened in this building over the past 3 months, because the city was too large to be reduced by specific human events, and she had always found this quality in it more comforting than alienating. "The Singapore contract came through today," he said. She looked at him. The Singapore Logistics Infrastructure contract was the one Victor Cross had underbid them on 18 months ago, using bid numbers she now understood had been fed to him through Malcolm Pierce. It had gone to Cross's company, and Cross's company had subsequently, in the reorganization following the federal referrals, been unable to execute it, and the contract authority had reopened the tender process. We underbid it correctly this time, she said. We bid it accurately, he said, which turned out to be enough. She almost smiled. Not quite, but the almost was real. Good. He looked at her for a moment with the particular quality of attention she had become familiar with over 3 months. Not the evaluating attention of the conference room, not the urgent attention of the amber-lit crisis, but the quieter and more considered attention of someone who has watched a person operate under extraordinary pressure and has been paying attention to more than the operational competence. There's a shareholder meeting in 6 weeks, he said. I want to present the restructuring outcomes. Full transparency, the fraud, the investigation, the federal referrals, the governance rebuilding, everything. He paused. I want you to present it with me. She looked at him. Why? Because it's yours, he said simply. The investigation, the evidence, the framework, the restructuring. It's yours, and the shareholders deserve to understand who did it and what it required. He held her gaze. And because I spent 22 years watching someone take credit for things other people built, and I don't want to run a company that operates that way anymore. She sat with that. Outside, the winter city did its enormous and different business. Inside, the office was warm and quiet and smelled of the coffee she had not yet touched. You should know, she said, that I'm going to keep finding things. I know, he said. The Singapore subsidiary's operational accounts have 3 vendor relationships that I'm not satisfied with. I started the review last Tuesday. It's probably nothing. It might not be nothing. Look at it, he said. I am looking at it. Then keep looking. She picked up her coffee. It was the right temperature. He had learned that too, somewhere in the 2nd month. That she didn't like it scalding, that she wanted it to be something she could actually drink rather than a gesture she had to wait out. She drank it. He sat with his own cup in the chair with the wobbling leg in the blue winter light of the 35th floor, and she sat across from him with the ordered files and the clean desk and the 3 months of rebuilt infrastructure behind her, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was fine. She had spent most of her adult life in rooms where silence meant she had been forgotten, and she had learned in the past 3 months that silence between people who are paying attention to each other is an entirely different thing. The shareholder meeting was on a Thursday in early spring, at a hotel ballroom in Midtown Manhattan that held 340 people, and smelled of fresh flowers someone had placed at the entrance in an effort to make the proceedings feel less institutional, and which had not quite succeeded. She stood at the podium in a suit she had bought for the occasion, not the oversized armor she had worn for 7 years at Hargrove and Sloan, not a performance of anything, just a suit that fit, and looked out at the room and felt the room look back at her and did not disappear. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not use softening language. She described the fraud in precise terms, the investigation methodology, the evidence, the federal referrals, and the governance restructuring, and she answered 7 questions from the floor with the same precision and the same absence of rhetorical softening, and she watched the room understand, question by question, that the woman standing at the podium was not performing anything. Adrian spoke after her. His remarks were shorter. He said what needed to be said about the future of the company and the people who would build it, and at the end he said one thing that was not in the prepared remarks she had reviewed beforehand. When I walked into a conference room in Lower Manhattan 6 months ago, he said, looking for information that no one in the room was willing to give me, a woman I had never met handed me the truth because she had been sitting with it for 11 days and had decided it was more important than her career. Everything Vail Global has done in the past 3 months, every fraud exposed, every corrupt relationship dismantled, every governance structure rebuilt, begins in those 11 days. He paused. She never needed anyone's permission to see clearly. She only needed the chance to matter. She was standing off to the side of the podium when he said it. She was looking at her hands. She looked up when he finished and found him looking at her from the lectern with the steady, unperformative attention she had come to understand as the way he looked at things he believed in. The room was applauding. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather, present, enveloping, real. She did not take a bow. She did not perform gratitude. She stood in it for a moment and let it be what it was. Afterward, in the lobby, a woman approached her, 71 years old by appearance, with the bearing of someone who had once sat at the center of considerable power and had made a separate peace with no longer being there. She introduced herself as Eleanor Voss, a Vail global investor since the company's second year. She had been in the room, she said, for every shareholder meeting in 29 years. "I've watched a great many people stand at that podium," she said. She had the voice of someone who has earned the right to say exactly what they mean. "Most of them were performing something. You weren't." Naomi looked at her. "No," she said. "That's harder than it sounds," Eleanor Voss said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She shook Naomi's hand with a grip that was entirely unambiguous and walked away. Naomi stood in the hotel lobby in the early spring afternoon and watched her go. And the afternoon moved around her, ordinary, unheroic, full of people going about the business of their lives. And she stood in it without disappearing into it, which was new and which she was still learning to trust. She took the subway back to the office. Not a car service, not a cab. The subway, which she had always taken, and which she continued to take because it was efficient and because the city, experienced from street level and underground, remained the realest version of itself. She sat in the train in the afternoon light and looked at her reflection in the dark window of the opposite door and thought about Eleanor Voss's 11 days, and thought about Gregory Holt's conference room, and thought about the heating vent above the chair nobody wanted at the far end of the table, and thought about the specific accumulated weight of being the person who does the invisible work for long enough that invisible starts to feel like identity. She thought about what it had taken to stop. Not heroism, not a transformation, not a sudden emergence into a version of herself that was fundamentally different from the woman who had sat under that rattling vent for 7 years. The same woman. The same precision, the same relentlessness, the same willingness to sit with difficult information until she understood it completely. Just aimed at something that knew she was there. The train moved through the dark under the city and came up into the light at 59th Street, and she sat with the light on her face and thought, fine. She thought, this is what it costs and this is what it's worth, and those two things balance out. The train carried her uptown through the ordinary afternoon, and the city spread out around her in its enormous, unreduced, indifferent complexity, and she was inside it, visible, grounded, neither disappeared nor transformed, but simply, precisely, finally, there.